Thank you, Reid, for that very warm welcome, and I want to thank Joe and all his team as well for what's been, by all accounts, a wonderful week of stimulating and focused debate about the state we're in. And I feel a great privilege, I suppose, to be here at the end of such a week. It is my job, I think, to give some kind of a historical perspective on some of these issues. And I suppose all of us tonight will be drawing various strands of what's been discussed during the week. Whether or not we're going to come up with any kind of coherent answer to this particular question, I don't know. But what we can do, and what I want to do at the outset, is to try and put this into some kind of historical context. I think there may be a danger with the title of tonight's discussion, the idea of building a republic that reflects the ideals and ambitions of the founders of that republic, of falling into the trap of assuming that those ambitions and those ideals of the founders of the Republic were clear-cut, were noble, were marked by unity of purpose. And I think the reality and the truth is that they were often compromised, those ideals and those ambitions. They were often distorted. Indeed, they were often forgotten, even at a very early stage of the 20th century. A very early stage of the Irish Revolution that we associate with the period from 1916 to 1923 in particular. I have no doubt that it took considerable political skill to build Sinn Féin into a very effective political movement and political party after the Easter Rising of 1916. If you look at all of those different opinions that existed within the broad nationalist stroke Republican family in the early 20th century, you will see that there were all sorts of divergent views, that there were those who didn't want a republic at all, that there have been particular individuals who perhaps have been neglected subsequently, people like Arthur Griffith, who were not necessarily looking at a solution that involved a republic. And of course the 1916 Rising changed things. And of course this organisational drive from 1917 onwards changed things as well. And I think if we look at some of the scholarship on this period to date, we can get that sense of an increased professionalisation of politics and of political organisation. Michael Laughlin, who's written the definitive history of Sinn Féin in that period, 1916 to 1923, has made the point that one of the great achievements of 1917 was the emergence of a sense of cohesion and common purpose within Sinn Féin, amongst a group of people that did have divergent views, and many of whom had disapproved of and distrusted each other prior to that particular drive in 1917 and indeed in 1918. And that is true. But it's also the case that what happened in 1917 and 1918 in terms of the organisation, it still masked a lot of ongoing compromises and a lot of ongoing tensions within the Sinn Féin movement. A gulf between the rhetoric on the one hand and the reality on the other hand, even at the time of the revolution. If you consider the democratic programme, for example, which was unveiled in the Mansion House at the time of the meeting of the First Dáil in January 1919, a statement of intent, an aspiration towards a fairer society and a fairer country and a more civilised country in many respects. A document that contained this fundamental promise that it shall be the first duty of the Republic to ensure that the children are catered for, to ensure, for example, that there will not be children who go hungry, that children will have a shelter, that their physical, mental, spiritual well-being will be catered for by this new Republic. The question I want to ask, I suppose, is how many people actually took that document seriously at the time in 1919, and indeed in subsequent years? Was this a classic case of rhetoric being enough as far as those particular individuals were concerned? Kevin O'Higgins was later to dismiss the democratic programme of 1919 as largely poetry. And he was also to comment in a debate on land seizures in the Dáil in 1923 that we were the most conservative revolutionaries that ever put through a successful revolution. And he seems to say that with a degree of satisfaction. And you do get that idea that we can leave all of that radical guff behind us. Another one of his contemporaries, Ernest Blythe, was interviewed about this at a much later stage. And he made the point that the Labour Party had secured the adoption of the democratic programme, but that most contemporary politicians at that time saw it as a kind of a hoisting of the flag, and it was not something that needed to be followed through on. If you considered, for example, the struggle that was commencing at that stage and the military struggle, the idea was that nobody was really going to take the democratic programme seriously within that context, and it was relegated in that sense to something of an irrelevance. And I think there's a degree of truth in that as well. You have to ask yourself this question as to whether that generation gave much thought as to the kind of republic they themselves wanted to see, given the priorities and the preoccupations that they had at that stage. I don't think individuals like Michael Collins, for example, were inclined towards ideological thinking in this regard. When Michael Collins was interviewed by an American journalist in 1920, he made the point that none of us have ever defined a republic. Now, he may have been talking about forms of government, but I think that when you consider that admission, you can also apply it to the social and cultural aspects of this future republic as well. The idea that they didn't actually take much time to try and define it, and the words that did exist around trying to define it were very quickly, I think, forgotten. So in terms of framing the discussion and rooting it in this question of what that generation wanted at that stage in the early 1920s, I think we have to remember that fundamental gulf between rhetoric and reality, particularly when you contrast the rhetoric and reality in relation to what perhaps has been the greatest blot on 20th century Ireland's copybook, its treatment of children. When you pitch those words and that commitment and that aspiration against the reality of what happened, you can see how stark that particular gulf was. That practical ambition was not there to match the kind of rhetoric that was such an important part of proceedings in 1919. There was no practical ambition to match that rhetoric around the protection of children. And this is a crucial point to think about this idea of building a republic that reflects the ambitions of this particular era. The idea that words are not enough, intentions are not enough, or statements of intent are not enough, programmes for action are not enough. Constitutional protection, perhaps, is not enough. They need to be matched with a practical commitment. They need to be matched with a commitment not to abrogate responsibility to others in these areas. And I think it's one of the most important duties of this republic, if we are to see this new republic or this fair republic, is to finally deliver on the promises that were made by the founders way back in 1919 in terms of the protection of children and the protection of the vulnerable generally. Now, that's not to dismiss the efforts of that revolutionary generation. I would not do that at all. This was overwhelmingly a revolution of the young, of the inexperienced, and we need to humanise this period. We need to underline the degree of bravery and idealism that was evident in Ireland during the revolutionary period 1916 to 1923. We need to acknowledge the compromises. We need to acknowledge the mistakes. We need to acknowledge the brutality as well. But we also need to acknowledge that many people took huge risks for little or no reward. And leaders, most leaders, were not urging people to take dangerous courses that they themselves were not prepared to take. This was, in many respects, about active participation. It was about the sacrifices of many. And it's another reminder, I think, if we need one, that if we are to reflect the idealism of those years, if we are to build this new republic, we do need a return to genuine public service. A kind of public service that has been so sullied in recent years and so compromised in terms of the pursuit of personal profit and the pursuit of megalomania as well. And that, I think, is something that doesn't cost money. And it's something that we need to think about in terms of the quality of public service and the quality of public representation as well. And it's not just about political leaders. It's also about challenging our own apathy and the apathy of the general public. How long did that endure for? When you consider the degree of apathy that existed around very fundamental issues in Irish society and very fundamental wrongs in Irish society as well. I was struck by an assessment that Gareth Fitzgerald made in March 2008 when he talked about one of the most striking things about Irish society in the contemporary era is the extreme passivity on the part of public opinion in the face of weak or maladministration by weak politicians. Now, when did that begin? And why did that endure? I don't necessarily have all the answers to these questions, but I do think it's something that we need to consider. We can't just focus on the idea of our political leaders letting us down if we have let ourselves down. We need to give attention to that as well. Now, there's no doubt that when you go back to that period, in particular towards the end of the War of Independence,
the beginning of the negotiations that led to the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December of 1921. There's no doubt that it was a very difficult period. There's no doubt that there were compromises and decisions that had to be made that would have grave consequences. I think one of the remarkable things about Michael Collins in this period was the sheer decisiveness that he showed once he had made a particular decision to support this treaty, to sign this treaty, and to try and sell this treaty. And I think, to give credit to his successors in the 1920s after his death, they showed a degree of decisiveness around crucial issues relating to state building, if you consider what was done in the 1920s and on into the 1930s as well. The emergence of a very effective and a very intelligent civil service, for example, an unarmed police force, the bedding down of the institutions of democracy in the 1920s and the 1930s, the maintenance of the security of the state during a very difficult decade for democracy when you place this in the context of Europe as a whole. Democracies were collapsing across Europe at that stage. And this harks back to a point that Joe Lee was making earlier on about the importance of political stability and not to take it for granted and not to underestimate it historically as well in terms of what it enabled people to do. There were other achievements there, I think, in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly in the realm of foreign policy. And this is another thing I think we need to give some form of attention to. If you think about the single-minded determination that existed in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s, to ensure, in the words of Joseph Walsh, the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs as it was then in the 1930s, that our international position will let people at home and in the world at large know that we are independent. They are simple words, but they are not necessarily very easy to deliver on in terms of a practical, genuinely independent foreign policy. And it did take a generation of very shrewd, of very independent-minded, of very ideologically driven, I think, public servants and politicians in order to bring about that independent foreign policy. Can we say that that is the situation in this day and age? That we do have that degree of independence when it comes to foreign policy? I don't think we do. Do we need to define what an independent foreign policy is? Do we need to define what neutrality is? Because there seems to be so much ambiguity around it. And if we are going to abandon any pretense towards an independent foreign policy, perhaps that needs to be stated clearly and needs to be argued publicly. A succession of historians have lined up in recent years to belittle the experience of Irish neutrality and the decision to keep Ireland neutral during the Second World War, including most recently Paul Bew. And it's now criticised as being a blatant moral failure. That's not an assessment that I would accept as a historian. I think ultimately this was about self-preservation. And of course, self-preservation is about self-interest, and there's an element of that in it. But it's also about a country that is not willing to get involved in a world war when that state, its state, is only 15 years old. It was the right decision to make at that stage. It was the logical culmination of Irish foreign policy in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it was a planned foreign policy. And it was thought through. And again, they are things that can be done in the modern era if attention is devoted to them, if the appetite is there to do that. Now, nonetheless, it's difficult to dispute the assertion which was often made by the end of the 1940s that in relation to social and economic questions, in relation to social services, if one was poor and vulnerable, it was nearly better to be born on the northern side of the Irish border than in the Republic, particularly when you consider the evolution of the British welfare state and the impact that that made on Northern Ireland in terms of a commitment to funding education and so on. And that's a reminder, of course, of the continuing social and economic failures of the Irish state and of the state builders at that stage. The Labour Party was marginalised for so long. It had been marginalised originally at the time of the Irish Revolution. The democratic programme, as I mentioned earlier on, was something that the Labour Party had an input into through its leader, Thomas Johnson. But it was, in many respects, marginalised during this particular period. And that had consequences in terms of the absence of ideology in Irish politics. And this became particularly apparent, I think, by the end of the Second World War and into the late 40s and early 1950s, when Europe begins to experience something of a boom. Ireland is left stagnating. There isn't this sense of an urgent debate about reconstruction, about creating a new type of society, a new type of economy. There isn't this urgency, it seems to me, about doing things differently. Ireland became a country that many people wanted to get the hell out of. And you can trace that culturally through some marvellous plays, the work of Tom Murphy, for example, A Whistle in the Dark, and all of these kind of representations of that sense of frustration and anger. And that idea of people not feeling that they have a future in Ireland and not feeling that they belonged in Ireland. And that, of course, was one of the great failures of the native state. Now, ideology was needed, I think, at that stage, and was lacking. And Labour was sidelined. It was, in some respects, afflicted by these poisonous internal disputes, which exacerbated its ineffectiveness. But it was also operating in a very hostile atmosphere and environment when you consider the influence of religion as well, and the constant giving in to the temptation to use the Red Scare when it was entirely unnecessary at that stage. But what about the two big parties that were there and were dominating politics and did dominate the Dáil at that stage as today? Sean O'Faolain made the point in 1945 in his wonderful magazine, The Bell, that Irish politics today are not politics. And he suggested that the two largest parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were indistinguishable from each other. Not because their policies were the same, but because neither of the parties had any policies or political ideas worth talking about. And he went on to describe the soldiers of destiny and the race of the Gaels as these silly, romantic titles that confessed a complete intellectual vacancy when it came to the reality of political ideas. Very harsh criticism, but articulating that sense of more of the same, that frustration with a party that has been in power for far too long, but being worried about the idea that the other large party doesn't seem to have any ideas that are particularly different in that regard. When I read that recently, it resonated with me. 65 years on, it still seems to have a relevance. Maybe it explains why the Labour Party seems to be doing quite well at the moment. Maybe it suggests that we do need a Labour-led government in this republic for the first time. That would be a manifestation, perhaps, of a new republic and perhaps a commitment to doing things differently. And this is something that I think, when you go back to the 1940s and the 1950s, you can sense that. You can trace that sense of frustration and that idea of there being a yearning, in some quarters at least, for things to be done differently and for new political ideas to emerge in particular. Now, maybe it's a reminder as well that we might need new political parties in order to define a new republic or reflect a new republic. And there has been some interesting questions, most of them I think not answered this week, about whether or not there may be the possibility of new political parties. But it does bring us back to this question of civil war politics. And we're often told that civil war politics are over, are dead, are gone. In 2002, the late and great Mary Holland wrote a newspaper column in the Irish Times in which she pointed out that she had written many columns over the years criticising the lack of a left-right-wing divide in Irish politics and, as she put it, the consequent deadening effect of virtual consensus on most ideas and in political debate generally. But she made the point then that I've come to rethink this. Civil war politics, she suggested, has actually served this state very well. The fact that political debate in this country was rooted in whose grandfather shot who actually saved us from some of the worst extremes of other forms of politics that were being experienced by some of our so-called sophisticated neighbours. And she gave the instance, of course, of Margaret Thatcher, loudly and proudly proclaiming that there is no such thing as society at a time when Ireland opted for the partnership model. Cooperation between employers, employees, cooperation between state and the market. This idea of that being a much more progressive form of politics. And there was certainly a degree of truth in that and a message in that that I think we need to listen to. But in the 10 years since that was written, or nearly 10 years, I think we can see what the absence of ideology, of ideas, of ideological thinking has done. The decision to let market forces run riot in particular has been a disaster and led to what Roy Foster, the historian, has described as a consequence of the Celtic Tiger years in his History of Ireland since 1970, what he referred to as a sometimes spectacularly unequal prosperity. And we do need, again, to look at this in its historical context. That consensus, I think, led to a fundamental denial of class issues in our society. The idea that these were old debates that were over. The idea, I think, as well, that one of the problems with all this was that powerful politicians were choosing to prioritise politics over policy. And you can see that as you trace the influence of various powerful politicians. Be that individuals like Paddy Hillary. Brian Cowan made the point at his funeral a few years ago that he built his career in a very kind of understated way because he was devoted to the idea of policy, particularly educational policy in the 1960s. Whereas people like Haughey seem to have abandoned the idea of policy. And he had many progressive policies and ideas in the 1960s, but became consumed with politics, with the cult of the leadership, with this quest, elusive quest for overall majorities. And that idea that you have to distinguish between those who were interested in politics and those who were interested in policy is an interesting one. Foster also castigates this notion, or what he calls the sanctimonious delusion, that those who justified this corrupting relationship between builders and developers and politicians, that they could justify it on the grounds that Irish people now had expectations to emulate the Anglo-Irish and the conditions in which they had lived in earlier times, that we could now aspire towards the Anglo-Irish standard of living and the Anglo-Irish standard of housing, or at least size of housing as well. I would see it very differently. It's one of the great ironies of modern Irish social history. We fought a land war in this country in the late 19th and the early 20th century. It was a very effective land war because the political power of the landlord class was broken by the tenants. But that landlord class was replaced 100 years later by a native class of landowners who exercised their domination of land and the market in an even more invidious way than some of the most wretched of the 19th century landlords. So you can see a huge historical irony. And it is up to the historian to try and look at some of those ironies as well. But I do want to acknowledge the positives. I do want to acknowledge the achievement of the women's movement in particular. Because when you go back to the ideals of the founders of the state and their ambitions at that stage, many women were involved in this as well. And many women were subsequently sidelined in this new Ireland from the 1920s onwards. Their hopes for equality were dashed. And when you consider those who are trying to create a feminist platform from the late 1960s and early 1970s on, in many respects we can see that as a return to the idealism and the ambitions of Irish Republican women in the early 20th century, albeit with an updated programme for change and programme for reform. And the Irish women's liberation movement can be depicted in some respects as being quite chaotic and short-lived and riddled with tensions and divisions and so on. But they did ensure that an irreversible start had been made to this idea of making the status of women in Irish society an issue that needed to be confronted. And it still needs to be confronted today. Recently, I was reading Nuala Fennell, the late Nuala Fennell's memoir about her time in Fine Gael politics in the 1970s. And she made the point that Gareth Fitzgerald, when he became leader of Fine Gael in 1977, suggested that women's rights were the wrong reasons to want to get into government. It may be a worthy motivation, he said, but it's the wrong motivation. That was and is, I think, condescending nonsense. And you only have to look at the state of women and Irish politics in contemporary Ireland to see how wrong that was. What Fitzgerald was doing there, I think, was actually denying the validity of women getting involved in politics to promote women's rights. In the same way that feminists in the early 20th century had been told they had to wait, in the same way that the Labour Party had been told in the early 20th century that it had to wait in order that the national question be solved. So I think that a lot of that mindset did prevent a lot of progress, a lot of change, and a lot of political ideas getting the kind of currency and the kind of audience and the serious discussion that they needed, particularly to try and build on the legacy of towering individuals like James Connolly, one of the great intellects of modern Irish political history, and indeed the women of Cumann na mBan and the sacrifices they had made in the early 20th century. It's quite clear there are not enough women involved in Irish politics. An all-party An all-party Oireachtas committee in 1989 wrote about this in the context of a review of the Constitution and suggested that because of that gender imbalance and the scale of that gender imbalance, it was quite clear that the knowledge, the sensibilities and the experiences of women were absent from the processes through which the state sought to express its values. That was written in 1989. It's as relevant now, 21 years later. Let me put this as starkly as I can. In the 90 years since the 1918 general election, 219 women have been elected out of 4,452 candidates. So out of all of those candidates, 219 women were elected. The rest of them men. That is putting it as starkly as you can, again, taking this long historical perspective. Now, I would finish by saying politicians do need to be upfront about what is wrong. They need to be upfront about what they are going to do about it, and what they are going to do that's different. They do need to speak freely. It has often been commented in relation to the MacGill Summer School that politicians seem to be able to express themselves more freely here than they can in the Dáil, or they can in other fora. And I wonder what the reason for that is. What does it mean about the quality of the public and political debate that we get? Is there too much spinning going on? Is there too much managing going on? Are politicians allowed to follow their gut instinct in I think, a way that they were at an earlier stage in Irish history? Why do they continually assert that they are conviction politicians, not ideological politicians, as if ideology has to be some filthy word in modern Irish politics? It's a mantra, I think, that has become somewhat exhausted. Are they genuinely ambitious in terms of tackling inequality? Look at what Donogh O'Malley did and said in 1966 when he was announcing the introduction of free secondary education. He was talking about every year 17,000 children not receiving any further education after their primary certificate. He talked about almost one-third of our future citizens being cut off from all of the cultural, economic and social benefits that go with further education. He said this is a dark stain on the national conscience. And he did something about it, despite the fact that the Department of Finance was implacably opposed to its introduction at that stage. Now, Donogh O'Malley died prematurely a few short years later. And when he died, Jack Lynch, as Taoiseach, paid a tribute to him, in which he said that Donogh O'Malley not only saw horizons that few of us dared to contemplate, he reached out beyond those horizons, anxious for the good that he could bestow on his fellow man. If there's one question I want to ask tonight, it's this. Why did so few dare to seek out beyond those horizons, or look beyond those horizons? And why was that particular example in 1966, why was it so different and why was it so unique? Why does a politician like Donogh O'Malley stand out? Because of this question of horizons and reaching out beyond traditionally limited horizons. So we do need, I think, to consider that. Perhaps it's not a question of returning to the ambitions and the ideals of the founders of the state, but maybe returning to the ideals and the ambitions of the 1960s, where you had a generation of politicians who were already questioning the ideals and the ambitions and the failures of those ideals and ambitions of those who had articulated them in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So therein, to finish, therein I think lie some of the keys to building a republic that reflects some of the idealism and the ambitions of the early 20th century. Genuinely cherishing children. A return to meaningful public service, daring to dream beyond these traditionally limited horizons, a clarity of thinking about our position vis-à-vis the rest of the world, and a rejection of this notion that ideology has to be an inherently bad and inherently un-Irish thing. Thank you.